Thank you for coming. We have a panel now that is near and dear to our hearts at Sports Innovation Lab. I'm the CEO, Josh Walker. If you follow anything that the Sports Innovation Lab has put out over the last few years, we were one of the first companies to really lean into women's sports. We lean into it in a way that is very different than the rest of the industry. We are not doing this because it's cause marketing or something we feel passionate about for sympathetic reasons or equality or diversity. Those things matter, of course. We're really focused on the business of women's sports, and that's what this panel is all about. We're driving money, we're doing deals, we're trying to get things done, and there's nobody better to spearhead that conversation than our moderator and our CMO, Gina Waldhorn. So I will leave it to you and the fantastic panel that has joined you today.
Thank you, Josh. And it used to be at CES that a women's sports panel would you'd get some tricklers in, and this is amazing. We've come really far, and I want to kick off today's panel. My guests are going to introduce themselves. We have amazing executives from TikTok, Ally Financial, from EA Sports, from Scripps Sports, but I want to start with some stats, and these aren't stats about women's equality or progress we've made. I want to talk about the fact that Deloitte has predicted that women's sports will generate $1.3 billion in revenue in the upcoming year. Woo! And I think we all saw the news about a week ago that the NCAA signed a deal with ESPN for $920 million over the next 8 years. And women's sports and women's March Madness accounted for an estimated over 57% of that deal. So the majority of that deal anchored in women's sports. And I know what some people say still, well, when you look at men's sports, that's just a drop in the bucket. It really can't compare those stats. That's nice, it's growing, but it's still not big enough. But I'd like to counter that and say that as an investor, I'm not looking for an asset that's reached peak growth. I'm looking for an asset that's growing. I'm looking for an asset that has 300% growth. That Deloitte number is up 300% from 2021. Sports Innovation Lab has a growth score that calculates the acquisition and retention rates of fan communities. And the women's sports fan community is growing at a rate that is 40% higher than men's sports. So as an investor, as a brand, as an organization that's looking to make money and drive revenue, we are all looking for growth, and women's sports has the growth. And that's what my panelists are here today to have a conversation about that growth as it relates to business and making business decisions. So to kick us off, I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves, tell us a little about your role and how women's sports is connected to your role. And then I want to hear a little bit about what were some of those first indicators that this might be the right place for you to start investing. So we'll start with you, Harish.
Thanks so much, Gina. Harish Sharma here from TikTok. I oversee the sports vertical, and a lot of times I get the question, what does that even mean? I'd say with specifically in context here for women's sports, the most interesting aspect of where sports really focuses on TikTok for us on the women's game is all about access. And when you think about the consumer, we always start by asking what is it that the consumer really wants, and then sort of work backwards and think about what does a platform have to represent. Because if you really think about it, a platform without the content actually is an empty experience. And so what we've looked at from a women's sports perspective is start not necessarily looking at DE&I as the mantra we want to use to then propagate a content strategy. It's actually, let's look at the consumer first, and let's find a way to get them access to all the content available, and let them democratically decide what's interesting and what's not. And that sounds really, really crazy, unless you have an algorithm that allows you to surface the content to the people and then allow them to determine what their experience is going to look like. And that's the unique place that TikTok plays, the unique place that TikTok has. And frankly, that's what's exciting about women's sport, and excited to talk about women's sport on TikTok, and frankly with my esteemed panelists as well.
Yeah, for a lot of companies, it can be seen as a risk, but if the consumers are asking for it, if you see it in the algorithm that they want more, it really demitigates that risk for you. Very interesting. Andrea.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Hoplane. I'm from EA Sports, and I oversee our publishing organization. That includes our brand organization, our marketing organization, our commercial organization. I'm also a proud Wolverine. Kate, I see you there. Women's sports is incredibly important to us, and sports in general at EA Sports. We have an audience that I believe is one of the largest sports fan communities on the planet. We have more than 350 million fans that come into our sports experiences on an annual basis. And at EA, more than 50% of that audience is women. And so just looking at those numbers, it's incredibly important that we do our job right and well. And similar to what you said, not only have the platform to serve those fans, but the right content to serve them. And so over the last many years, we've invested deeply in women's sports across a variety of our sports games: hockey, football, American football. We've got women's refs inside of Madden, golf, and more. And so we're really deeply invested in growing the sport, most specifically because the audience is there, the audience demands it. And to represent sport, you need to represent all of sport.
Absolutely. Our second Andrea.
I know, two Andreas on the same panel. I'm Andrea Bremer. I'm a proud Spartan, so the other Andrea's shoes are burning my eyes. But I'm going to give you your day since you won a natty last night. I'm the Chief Marketing and PR Officer at Ally, and you're probably like, what does a bank have to do with women's sports? About a year and a half ago, we made, during the 50th anniversary of Title IX, we saw an opportunity in what I thought was an exceptionally evergreen space, and kind of saw around a corner in terms of what was happening with women's sports. And we made a public pledge that for every dollar we spend in men's sports media, we would match dollar for dollar in women's sports media. At the time that we made the pledge, we spent 90% of our sports budget in men's sports and 10% in women's sports. At the end of last year, a year after we made the pledge, we were at 60% spend in men's sports and 40% spend in women's sports. And I would say by hopefully mid-year of this year, we'll be at 50-50. And we'll talk a lot about what that has done for our business. I think it has been substantive in terms of changing the narrative around the fact that women's sports make good business. And it's been something that I've never seen connect both consumers, employees, people in the brand ecosystem the way that this pledge has in anything that I've ever done in my 30-plus year career.
Wow. And you know, a lot of folks know, especially the brands in the room, brands like to get awarded for being innovative, but they never actually want to go first. And I think what you did, and you stewarded with Ally, we saw the true rising tide, because after you made that announcement, we saw Michelob Ultra, we saw CarMax, we saw Canadian Tire dedicating $100 million, trying to match your pledge. And you really moved an entire industry. So we'll talk a little bit more about it, but that's incredible. I mean, to get brands like that to move is pretty amazing. Brian.
Good morning. I'm Brian Lawler. I'm the president of Scripps Sports. Scripps is a 140-year-old media company who every day is trying to act like we're not 140 years old. A year ago, we announced the formation of a sports division, and it really was predicated on the opportunity of some of the changes that we foresaw in the local media and the regional sports network space. But also during the pandemic, we had bought ION, which is the 5th highest rated network in America behind NBC, ABC, CBS, and Fox. All of them have a pretty significant sports commitment, and the prior owners at ION had not committed to sports. And so after we acquired ION, we sort of spent a year stepping back and looking at the sports ecosystem to determine if we had a place to play in sports. And a little over a year ago, sat down with the CEO and the CFO and the executive team and sort of laid out what we saw happening in sports. And one of the things that we told them was, it's really hard to be a women's sports fan in America. It's complicated and it's impossible to find where a game is, and it's, you know, there was no consistency. And we felt like we had a network, because it was unencumbered with any sports, that actually could seize on the opportunity. And so Gina, your comment earlier about a growth trajectory for women, we were looking at exactly all the metrics that you were all, spending all your time looking at. We're looking at tremendous ratings and growth in the WNBA and the NWSL and their championship games. We saw, of course, the women's basketball and the incredible competitive energy that was around that and great ratings. Other NCAA sports, women's gymnastics, volleyball, softball. And so as we presented to our board last November, our thesis of we think there's an opportunity for ION to play in sports, much of that conversation was we think we have an opportunity to be a leader in women's sports. And I don't think there's a company that's made a bigger investment in women's sports in the last year than us. We stepped up and made an investment and acquired the WNBA and had all of their rights on Friday nights and created a national franchise. 15 weeks of consistent, every week, same time period, a national franchise.
First time that
ever.
has ever been done. I mean, it's like, yay, but really we had to wait until 2024 to get a dedicated franchise. So thank you for paving that road. That's huge.
Well, and then we did it again.
Yep.
We were part of the NWSL announcement, the largest sports deal in the history of American sports. And ourselves, CBS, Prime, and ESPN partnered to put together what I think is a really innovative sports rights and distribution platform. But we'll be creating a franchise night on Saturday night, a doubleheader for 25 weeks, for both the WNBA and the NWSL, a studio show, a pregame show, a wraparound show in between to very much look like the NFL. So, a year ago when we started this, we kind of went public and said we want to play in women's sports, and I'm really proud that I think we've invested heavily, and we think that we are, really creating a platform and a place for women to know for people to know where to find women's sports and begin to develop a habit around it.
Yeah, you got the assignment. You showed up. That's amazing. So we're talking about from buzz to business. And I want to hit on, there still needs to be, we've got these great growth scores, we have these amazing stats, but there still needs to be a business case that all of you have to make to your boards, to your CEOs about why to do this. So Andrea, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what did you see the potential of women's sports to do for your business? Why are the fans the right people? And maybe what are some early indicators that you might be seeing that it's working? But what really helped you convince to mitigate the risk, to make the investment that this was right for Ally?
I didn't tell anybody. I just did it. No, that was part of it. And all joking aside, look, the reality is that women still control over 80% of household purchases. You see more wealth being aggregated among female consumers than ever before. As a financial services company, ensuring that we're reaching out, we're touching, we're speaking to women in substantive ways was critically important. But not just women. What we're seeing, particularly with younger fans, is that you have a really duality of both male and female fans that are flocking to women's sports. And I think that's part of what needs to be broken down in terms of myth, is that women's sports are only for women. We sponsored the Ally Tip-Off this year. It was the first time that women's college basketball had a proper tip-off game. It was Virginia Tech versus Iowa at the Spectrum Center in Charlotte. It was on ESPN, sorry. And I looked around that crowd purposely, and I would say at least 60 to 70% of the crowd was young boys who all wanted Caitlin Clark's autograph. Right, everybody, and so it was an amazing moment. And so for us, what we've seen since we launched the 50-50 pledge and really built out the portfolio that we have in women's sports, I look at it now 2 years later, we are at the highest level of brand awareness in our company's history. We are the highest level of consideration in the history of our company. We are at the highest level of likability in the history of our company. We were only one of 4 banks that grew in terms of trust, particularly after the SVB failure last year. The financial services category took a nosedive. We actually grew, and we grew faster than any other banking brand. And we had just an amazing year in terms of everything from customer acquisition to quarter after quarter revenue growth. And so it's working by every single metric we look at. And we're still getting it in a place where we have a lot of space to run and you can really break through versus some of the things that we're doing in men's sports.
Yeah, I think women's sports offers a lot more creative flexibility still today to integrate your brand, to work with the athletes, the storytellers, and some of the emerging properties and leagues. As Athletes Unlimited here, there's so much flexibility to get close with those leagues and those teams and those brands that you can't do in traditional sports. Andrea, tell us a little bit about, for EA, and Harish, you spoke about this too, it's kind of like about what the business case can be, what your consumers want, what your gamers want. What are you seeing in terms of metrics and things that are convincing you and your organization that this is the right place to invest when you either do test or you hear back from consumers? How do you know this is going to work?
I mean, we're constantly driven by the wants and the needs and the asks of our players. We spend a lot of time in consumer research. We also spend a lot of time watching. We have an incredible data platform, as you might imagine, and are able to see what's happening inside of our games on a daily basis. And so that leads and guides a lot of us, a lot of what we're doing. But the response, we've not been in this business a short amount of time. We've been in the business of sports for a couple of decades now at EA Sports, and really invested in delivering women's sports for more than a decade. And so, the response and the performance, we've grown double digits in terms of revenue growth and double digits in terms of engagement growth over the last decade of our business, consistently year over year. And a lot of that is being driven by what we're seeing in the representation and the growth of all of the teams, all of the clubs, all of the athletes inside of the game. In particular, one of the things that I've been most pleased to see is in the last year, we introduced women into one of the most competitive modes inside of our EA Sports FC game, which is our big football game, global football game. There's 19,000 athletes inside of that game across 700 teams, and we introduced women into this really competitive mode that's sort of a big driver of our business. And we were a little nervous. It's a fantasy mode, just to explain it for everybody a little bit. It's a fantasy mode where people go and assemble teams, and you compete your fantasy team against another team. In the real world, you don't see men competing against women on the pitch in global football. In our game, you can do that now inside of Ultimate Team. And we were a little nervous about this decision, about how players would respond. We knew it was the right, fun way to drive fantasy and to drive equity and equal experience. We've seen more than 40% of our players equip at least one woman on the team. In many cases, it's multiple women, because they see the competitive value of these athletes on the pitch to help advance their team's success inside of our game.
That's like totally breaking this fallacy. I think it's still, we talk about, and everyone hears the stats, but it doesn't sink in. Just, that females game, that gamers want women's sports, that women's sports fans are gamers. And then to hear something like they had 19,000 to choose from. That's how many players?
19,000.
And 40% of the teams put at least one female player on their team. It's hard to argue with that kind of stat. That's incredible. That's awesome. Everyone tweet that, X that, whatever you do on that platform. Harish, I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about what you're seeing from TikTok users. What do they want? What about some of the athletes, the creators? We saw I love the TikTok shop down the hall right there. There's so much that I think female athletes and fans can do and respond to and get involved in the game on TikTok. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how women's sports is opening those doors, what you're excited to do on the platform in women's sports, given that your users are showing you that they want more of it.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. I mean, it's so interesting to hear very different perspectives on this panel on their approaches. And for me, I think a lot of what I led this conversation with was this idea of allow the demand and the consumer to dictate your strategy. I'd say the other side of that is, and this is something that we've actually thankfully been able to prove out, and I think we took some swings, and I don't think we knew what was going to happen, but we had conviction. I think it's this idea of allow yourself to be led by commercial outcomes, meaning if you are able to build the business case that's full circle, the demand side and on the other side, fulfillment, you will actually prove its value. And what does that mean? So I'll give a couple of examples of how that's manifested for us. In terms of creators and publishers, Burnley Women's, I don't know if you are familiar with the team. They play in England. The women's team came to TikTok and they had no sponsor on their jersey. And like every conversation you can probably imagine, out there, you're looking for sponsors. If you are a team, you're looking for funding, you're looking for ways to be differentiated. The men's team, of course, is in the Premier League and is sponsored. And so these are the same exact organization. They just happen to be a men's and women's team. We sat down with them and said, let's build a plan for you that's going to ultimately get you to this outcome. We may not necessarily be the logo on the jersey, but we're going to be everything that we can be for you. So what that manifested in was a form of live rights and live distribution that they had access to, that they ultimately didn't have any place to put previously. And we built an entire strategy for how they were going to launch on TikTok exclusively with that kind of content. Now, they put that content in a bunch of places, but then we also helped them take that content and then now go onto the non-live side and actually build profiles for every one of their players. Because it turned out people really care when they know who you are. Caitlin Clark, I want that autograph too, by the way. So as it turns out, the vast majority of consumers are not looking at sport for this context of, is this a man or is this a woman? They're looking for elite athletes. That's ultimately what it is. And so once you recognize that, it doesn't really matter whether this person is wearing a jersey of a brand or of a team that I care about. I just recognize it. And so that entire process didn't happen overnight. And our friends at Athletes Unlimited, and I don't know if Haley Rosen's here from just JWS, they've been investing in this for a long time. And so Burnley kind of did the same thing and said, we'll go on this ride with you. The outcome of that was they generated so much more buzz and media value from their presence on TikTok that they now have a sponsor. Not only do they have a sponsor, but now they have doubled down on their commitment to TikTok. So ultimately, I look at this as a triumph of the commercial outcome, which was the goal from the beginning.
Get a
But
sponsor.
get a sponsor. But it turns out the way to get there didn't involve traditional means, because that's not what's going to work necessarily for women's sport. It just means that you have to do things differently. I have a few examples of this, but I'd love to end on that, because I think that's a way to kind of articulate how it's showing up on TikTok.
Absolutely. We talk a ton at the Sports Innovation Lab about the fluid fan, this idea of the future fan who wants, like you said, elite athletes, but storytelling. And they want rivalry, and they want entertainment. And women's sports delivers that oftentimes in a way that I don't think the men's athletes feel they have to, so they don't give as much to it. And so giving them that channel, I think, is just extraordinary. And when those business outcomes prove that that's what the fluid fans were looking for, it's a win-win for everybody. I want to talk a little bit now about, there's still, there's the buzz. That's why we named this panel From Buzz to Business. There's a lot of talk, but that it's still not always turnkey and easy to invest in women's sports. So maybe Andrea, talk a little bit about, from the brand side, what have been some of the barriers that you've experienced? And then I'd love to flip it to the media side, because I know sometimes there's a little, well, that's not the inventory, well, the brands aren't showing up. I'd love to hear kind of, what are you looking to get more from the industry? What needs to be easier? What have you done to help break down some of these barriers to investing more in women's sports?
Yeah, I mean, look, it kind of, from a strategic standpoint, we had a pretty simple three-pronged strategy. Strategy one was working with legacy media partners to create more inventory and more accessibility. Probably best example of that was a massive partnership that we did with Disney ESPN, where we spent multi-millions of dollars. We sat down at the table together, and we literally insisted that 95% of all of the inventory that we bought be in women's sports. That was a great example of working with legacy media partners. And you need to continue to push on that, because there is the vicious cycle, and I, as a brand, am very sympathetic to it. If the brands aren't going to come, and I've said this publicly a million times, It starts and ends with the brands. Because if I'm not going to bring him a check, he's not going to go to his board and talk about investing in women's sports. And that's just the reality of it. So somebody had to blink, and we decided, let's blink. So working with legacy media partners, it was the first part of the strategy. The second was supporting emerging media platforms. You talked about just women's sports, but the lack of accessibility of content and coverage of women's sports has been something that has plagued both the leagues and the athletes as well as brands. And so supporting brands like Just Women's Sports, The Gist, Goals, all of these platforms that have started to exist now that are solely focusing on women's sports. Re-Inc., which is Tobin and Kristen Press platforms. So that's been a big part of the strategy. And then the third has really been about putting money directly in athletes' pockets, because at the end of the day, these women still don't make money playing sports. Look at the average salary of the WNBA. It's way bigger than the average salary of the NWSL. Average salary of an NWSL player, $35,000 a year. How do you survive on that? And these are the women that are going to go take the field and represent our country in the women's in the World Cup. And so putting money directly in athletes' pockets has been huge. Things like format of Team Ally, working with you guys and creating the Women's Sports Club, where we're bringing brands together. And you have to pay a tax to get into the Women's Sports Club, and that is that you have to agree to do something real in women's sports if you want to be in the club. And it's been about making connections. And so I think it's a lot of problems. It's not just one.
Yeah.
And you've got to attack it on a lot of different fronts as a result.
Yeah. Next, Andrea, we had a great chat about some of the barriers that were surprising to me from a technical standpoint in investing. And it's not as easy as just, add so-and-so to the game. Talk a little bit about what you had to overcome.
Well, I love what you just said, is you have to agree to do something real. And I think that really well encapsulates what we had to overcome at EA Sports. Being in the business for a really long time and starting with the men's game across the board in all of our titles meant that we had built really deep skeletons. What I'll call a skeleton is sort of the underneath of the body of the avatar that people play. And we had built all of these avatars for all of these athletes around the world, and they were all men. They were all men's rigs. And as someone who played football growing up, I was a soccer player, I know we play differently. We move differently. We run differently. Clothing drapes us differently. There's not a world that you can do it and invest in and do it real and make a real difference if you're putting a female head on top of a male skeleton. It just doesn't work. And so it actually took us a little longer than just introducing women into the game authentically. We had to build the skeletons and build the right technology over a couple of years. We did a significant amount of research with Copa 90 and really made sure that our teams deeply understood the nuances of the women's game, how we play, how we run, again, how clothes drape on us differently, and use that to build an entirely new skeleton system that is now crossing all of our games at EA Sports, so that not only are we showing up and representing the women's game in all of its glory and introducing fans to all of the female athletes around the world, but we're also doing it the right way and doing it authentically and representing them in who they are.
Yeah, and I mean, you did not shrink it and pick it. That's what we lift it and shift it, or shrink it and pink it. That happens too often. And if it takes years, then you make the commitment and you do it. That's exceptional. And those graphics are you'd notice it. And we talk about the fluid fandom. Josh always talks about how his two little boys become fans of athletes on games first, on FC first. And they'll never have watched a live match before. And they are diehard fans of this athlete because of the game. So to have, you don't want a head on a funky body. So to switch to the publisher side, what are some of the barriers you're seeing? I believe TikTok offers training. What might, inhibit or thwart brands or content creators on the rights side, rights holders, to do more on TikTok? And what are you helping them overcome, or what would you want to encourage them to overcome to do more in women's sports on your platform?
Yeah, I think the challenge for publishers writ large is less about women's sports specifically, but I think it's the challenge of how do I represent myself on a platform that's extremely competitive, and frankly democratizes the voice. And then basically what that means is having an extremely large platform or brand can be seen as sort of like the albatross, right? And so if you have a lot more to lose in theory, you're probably intimidated by the concept. And so I'd say the goal has been very much about having and meeting our publisher cohort where they are. So for our probably biggest, most well-known publishers, they're just facing a different set of challenges, right? They have to excel, right? And I'll give an example, but if you're dealing with, the likes of the big leagues, for example, they have an expectation that they're going to be extremely successful, right? And I'll give a shout out to someone who's in the room here, and not to embarrass him, but from FIFA, with whom we launched a very, very significant partnership around the Women's World Cup. And the organization, FIFA, took a huge, huge gamble, not just to put the women's game on an equal footing with the men's game, but actually to do something for the women's game that they've never done for the men's game, which is to actually have a social media strategy that was centered around what they did with us on TikTok. So that's a first, right, for the women's game. And it's a first that was led by the interest from the publisher. That's huge. Anybody who's worked in sports, anybody who's worked in the industry knows how difficult it is to move away from inertia. And I think, and kudos, and I won't embarrass you, but you're in the room. And ultimately, that says a lot, right? So to be able to take that leap and be willing to do that is a big first step. The other side of that is also ultimately understanding that the tools that we provide, whether that's showing you that you have to follow a very, tried and tested regimen. You have to vary the content that you post. You have to be okay with the fact that not every time you post something will you get the response you're expecting, and every time you see success, it's not going to be something you can just automatically rinse and repeat. And I think that's the challenge. You don't just get to do one thing and do it again and again and again. We're not a one-trick pony. That's very obvious, and it can be frustrating, but that's sort of why we're here. I think that's the point. We're meant to be here to serve as that. By the way, we can show you what this looks like anonymized across the entire ecosystem, and we can help you understand how to be successful. And I think that's ultimately the best thing we can do.
Yeah, I love Gary Vaynerchuk always said when people used to ask him, well, how do I get successful on social media? And he'd say, be social. You can't just post something and then walk away, or put your content calendar out and put it on autopilot. And so I think the training programs and the tools and the way you're teaching the brands and helping them take risks, but with the understanding that it's a different kind of platform. There's a unique way to use it. It takes time, and you have to be social. You have to really integrate into that environment in order to see success. So yeah, kudos to whoever you are from FIFA. Great job. And so we also talked a little bit about in our research, we mentioned the discoverability and this vicious cycle, and well, the brands want more inventory, but the inventory doesn't exist unless there's brand demand, but there's not going to be brand demand if they don't feel like there's fan demand. But why are fans going to want to tune in if it cuts into the game in the middle of the first quarter because the men's game ran long and there's not like a nice, pre-show and post-show, and they're not even good stuff. It is a vicious cycle. So I'd love Brian to chat a little bit about what you guys are doing in your perspective, and anyone on the panel, about breaking this vicious cycle, and specifically around kind of original content creation and giving fans more of what they want and what, to be quite frank, that men's got. I know you guys are doing some interesting work around WNBA and NWSL in that space.
Yeah, before I answer that, I just want to say, sitting here listening, I think the four companies that are up here, we're up here because all four of us were really comfortable in being leaders. We were intentional about taking a leadership position in women's sports, and we got comfortable taking on risk. And, committing half of your budget, right, to women's sports, huge risk. Putting women into a men's game, huge risk. And so, it's not, it shouldn't be lost on this room that it does take risk and leadership for us to move along women's sports in America. And I think you have four of the leading companies up here that are doing it. for us, we acquired Ion, and we got this tremendous, high-rated network that has an incredible following. It runs procedurals, lots of days of Law and Order and SVU and NCIS, but people watch a ton of it. And there was no sports on it. And so we had a lot of conversation about the risk associated with suddenly putting sports on it, and especially women's sports. And would it fit, and would people accept it? And so it took a huge commitment on our company, realizing we may be taking a step backward in order to be moving forward the industry and ultimately what we hope is a good business proposition for us. We had a really good first season with the WNBA. We delivered almost 10 million viewers. We had 6 million unique viewers on Ion. What was cool was that we brought viewers and fans to the WNBA who had never been fans of the WNBA before, and fans of the WNBA came to us who had never watched Ion before. And to Andrea's point earlier, at the end of the full season, our audience profile was 50% male, 50% female, and it was younger and more diverse than the typical Ion audience. And it was almost 50% African American. Very different than the Ion. So it was sort of a win-win that new people came and got to experience Ion. We brought new viewers and new fans, and our commitment over the course of the season lifted the overall reach of the WNBA by 26% because of the nearly 10 million viewers we brought them. So incredibly successful, but to your point earlier, at the end of the day, our success will be dictated by brands. And so we're very lucky that State Farm stepped up and was our title sponsor. And we launched it with 5 weeks before the season started. So, it probably didn't meet the expectations and the goals we wanted, but now we've got a full season behind us. We have a full season ahead. Again, we're establishing these franchise nights on a network now that people are starting to get used to having sports on it, especially women's sports. And the idea that we're going to, have that brand consistency every week. And that's one of the things we found with the WNBA. Their greatest fans, their most loyal fans found us and then came back every week. And the stickiness of those fans was immense. So, now we're kind of going that next step. We're going all in. We're going to build a studio show. So for each, the WNBA and the NWSL, we're going to have a studio show Friday night and Saturday night from 7 to 7:30. The leagues have agreed to tip off their East Coast games at 7:30, so we'll have a game, a basketball game on Friday night, WNBA at 7:30, NWSL Saturday night at 7:30. Those games run about 2 hours. We'll come back to a studio show, set up our second national game, and then have a national game from 10 to midnight. So it's a massive commitment. And we believe that the audience will continue to follow based on the audience. I mean, within 4 or 5 weeks in season 1, we had already passed ESPN in ratings for a network that had never had sports before. So people were catching on.
No risk, no reward.
No. So I think, this is going to be an important season for us moving forward, and we hope the fans will follow, and we hope the brands will follow.
Amazing. So we have just another minute or two left. We're at CES. CES is all about innovation, the future, what comes next. So I'd love to go quickly down the line. What are you most excited about? You can be selfish and promotional and tell me what you're excited about on TikTok with women's sports, or just personally, if it's about the new hockey league, or what are you excited about in the future for women's sports?
I'm actually really excited about what we are working on right now. Can't say too much, except that we're innovating the offering. I'm excited about it because I know that we're going to be able to marry these two worlds that I've been talking about in a very, very elegant way.
Anything with shopping? Will we get athletes doing the shopping?
I think you're going down the path.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, quick, excited about. I love the continued investment, and as a Bay Area resident, I'm really excited about WNBA and NWSL now having teams coming to the Bay. In terms of prediction, the youngest generation of fan, their first form of entertainment is interactive and gaming. And so I think my prediction for all of you is you are going to see EA Sports become a true leader in sports, not just a licensor of video games. And so watch out, watch to see what's coming.
I think for me, the thing I'm most excited about is this next generation isn't saying women's sports and men's sports. They're just saying, I'm a sports fan. And we're going to start to change this narrative with this next generation and beyond.
And I'm most excited about all of the games that are now moving to national over-the-air broadcast television. 50 games for the NWSL, the WNBA. We saw ESPN's deal, their announcement that the women's basketball, women's volleyball, women's, I think gymnastics are all going to be on ABC over the air. Making these games more visible, solving a reach problem, I think is really exciting to honor these athletes.
Yeah, let's not make women's sports fans have to work so hard to find the sports they love. Well, thank you to my incredible panelists, executive leaders paving the way. Thank you to all of us for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of the show.